90% of the book explaining the problems.
But he comes back to a problem over and over again, and I think it was the idea of the lack of a unified budget, the idea that there are so many unfunded liabilities where we're borrowing from each other, where we're raiding the Social Security Fund, where, as you pointed out, the Iraq War is not actually included in the budget. The idea is we want to put all unfunded liabilities into a unified budget so that the public has a better informed view of what we're actually looking at. Because a lot of times the debt is hidden in these loans that we're taking from each other, and that sounds like a really nice term, but it really isn't. And I think we had a really interesting discussion about what to do with things like Social Security, because that was one of the problems of the lack of a non-unified budget. Are we going to look at raising the age of Social Security? Because as Margaret pointed out, when it was created in 1935, life expectancy was different, and now the workforce dynamic is different. We also talked about the historic dynamic of paying for wars. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, there was a special tax that was levied, yet with the Iraq War, the taxes were actually cut. So I think we could kind of drop it in there. Peterson points out on page 62 that we've gone from the mid-30s to 14% for future-oriented spending, which is what you said with human capital. Margaret pointed out earlier, IRS being a little more efficient. We're losing $300 billion a year in uncollected revenue. We thought we would look at the state tax. So I think we had a great discussion. Clearly, we can continue that.
Yeah, he also mentions, and we didn't bring up in our conversation, is the idea of political reform, that redistricting or gerrymandering and the influence of political extremes has sort of led to a political stagnation that, he cites Iowa as having this independent redistricting and the idea of pushing more for Big Tent candidates or Big Tent politicians, and that might increase the willingness for people to compromise because, their seats are less secure or they're less beholden to far left or far right supporters. He has a whole chapter on what can and should be done.
As well as he talks about how no political candidate is going to say, I want to cut spending and not bring back programs to my home allocation. The consistency and so forth forms of that.
But something that Yarrow points out, that earmarks, even though those are the ones that get the attention, and that was a strategy Reagan used to ruin welfare, the welfare queens with Cadillacs. He would use a very, very narrow perspective to get public opinion to go in one direction. Earmarks are less than 1% of the federal budget. Right. Now, that's not to say that we should waste 1% of the federal budget, right. But that is the sexy hot button issue that people say, oh, we have $1 million museum for cheese, you guys are out to lunch. Well, the issue more is, how about military spending on planes that were meant to fight the Soviet Union, things like that.
What would be, it's hard to quantify, but one of the things that's often said is that Americans personally don't save enough. So would there be any positive effect on this subject we're dealing with if Americans started to up their savings rate substantially?
It would depress the economy right now.
It would. No, it would. But over the long run, would there be any positive effect to that in terms, culturally, ideologically, it might certainly have an effect, but fiscally, would it have an effect?
Moving, because keep in mind that aggregate demand, the high end of aggregate demand is more of a corporate, not necessarily the investors that you and I come up with. So maybe one way is if you did increase savings rate, the C would go decrease a lot, right, fiscally. So if you decrease C, then there's the idea that the aggregate demand would be lower in general. Because you're decreasing the C component of the consumption part. Is that what you're...
No, I'm just wondering if it would, the Japanese, someone told me that when Japan, of course, had their doldrums decade, which they're still sort of in, that they, the level of consumption never has returned to the level that it was prior to that time. Now, he talks about, or someone talks about that bridge that they built in Japan that was an effort to stimulate, longest bridge in Japan to stimulate things, but, and they spend so much money to stimulate the economy, but it's still, they're not in terrific shape financially, so even with a higher rate of personal savings and a lot of fiscal stimulus from the federal government, that doesn't necessarily get you out of trouble. I mean, I'm just wondering if personal savings have anything to do with this scenario. What do you, Brad, do you think?
I definitely think it does. I think one of the things that's interesting too, when you talk about the aggregate demand model, and the assumption that you're making is that economic growth is success. And I think that when you look at it strictly as the GDP in those terms, that yes, personal savings might not be positively correlated, but I think that in terms of debt, I think debt is something that occurs long over time. And I think that the ability for individuals to save and a greater portion of their income and use it in the future, I think is generally better for the country becoming less indebted. And I also think it will, and I have to go through this more, but I think it will have a positive effect on interest rates in the future in terms of like the ability to invest in the future, which then could go towards more growth. But and the people who I think will write like this, and the Peterson people, I think that's one of their goals, is to try to increase personal savings. I know that in terms of financial literacy, that's something that they're trying to do, and I think part of it is like a modeling of behavior. They want the government and our people to sort of to be a little bit better.
But you could also make the argument, if you increase personal savings, that that there is a possibility that the government will have less buyers for their
T-bonds.
T-bonds and so forth, and so that would do some changes, but that's thrown out by foreign investment.
It also, I mean, takes the pressure off things like such as Social Security, for
Right.
sure.
Okay. Scott, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that if personal savings rate did increase a substantial level and the number of people who were saving increased that as well, then things like Social Security wouldn't be such a make or break issue, because people would say, well, Social Security is going to be nice, but it's going to be the addition to what I've already saved such that I can live. You know, I think in that way it would happen.
I see the decline or the deterioration of the savings rate in the country is more an effect than a cause, and that it refers to the systematic stagnation of wages of middle and lower class people, and in conjunction with that, the nature of the consumer market in this country is compared to Japan, where built-in obsolescence needs to be built into every product, you know, from this laptop to your car, to your home, etc. And so those two factors taken combined, I'm not saying that people don't waste money, they certainly do, but I think that is also a pressure that tamps down savings rates, and that generally is never examined in these sorts of works.
And I'm going to keep searching to answer that question, to figure out the savings rate, how much the variable in the savings rate would affect GDP as well as.
That's a great question.
It's such a small, I think it's such a small percentage, but I can figure out